Thank you so much. Uh, Dear friends, I welcome you to this important course on tipping points in cataract surgery. Today, we have a galaxy of faculty to share their points, and we have variety of topics that together will make cataract surgery very interesting. Now, this course has 7 faculty members, and each of us will take 8 minutes, and that will leave us some time for discussion at the end. And with this, we come to the first and the opening batsman, and none other than Dr. Arup Chakravarti. He is the editor proceedings for AIOS, a prolific academician who has spent several valued times over the years educating and training many of the ophthalmologists all over the world. In fact, he's a regular trainer at American Academy, ASCRS, ESCRS, and AIOS for last several years. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Arup, and the topic for him today is tipping points in managing PCR and PPC. Over to you, Arup.
So, a very good evening, friends. My slides are visible, and am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, thank you, Dr. Suhas sir, for inviting me for this prestigious program. And I'm also very happy that you asked me to speak on posterior polar cataract, which is a topic which is very close to my heart. I started doing this challenging situation, I think about 92 or 93, when there are not many techniques that were available while dealing with these cases. We did not know the various challenges. And I kept on evolving my technique. And since 95, 96, I've been following a particular method, particular technique, a strategy, which has given me very good results. And this is what I'm going to share with you in my presentation today. The main challenge in these situations is the fact that the posterior capsular rent can happen, and it can happen at all stages of cataract surgery. It may be pre-existing, like congenital posterior capsular dehiscence. It can happen during hypocortical cleaving hydrodissection. If it is performed by mistake, we don't do it. It can happen during nucleus cracking if it is not cracked properly. Vacuuming of the posterior capsular plaques, which again is not recommended. I have also have the mortification of seeing PCA develop while trying to bag the intraocular lens. And I have seen cases where in the recent past, posterior capsular rent happening in PPC, posterior polar cataracts during stromal hydration. I'm not sure whether that is related to flax which this patient had undergone. So they are seen in about 3 to 5 out of 1,000 cases that we do. 80% of them are bilateral. And these are very easy to pick up clinically. All these patients that are projected here had developed posterior capsular, had a pre-existing posterior capsular rent. You can see a spindle defect here. You can see the white dots, onion hole appearance, tri-radiate extension. So they are very easy to pick up. And in certain situations, when they come with an advanced nuclear sclerosis, in a brunescent cataract, where the underlying posterior polar component may be concealed, if you look at the fellow eye, if it happens to be aphakic or if it is pseudoaphakic for the PC there, then you can easily assume that you are dealing with a posterior polar cataract. Recently, diagnostic imaging has been applied to posterior polar cataract, and for example, the anterosegment OCT, a lot of signs have been described. However, if you have this technology, that is fine, but even if you don't have this technology, it's nothing to worry about, because all posterior polar cataracts, we are careful. Each posterior polar cataract is as important as the next case. The strategy that they follow is the same. So I have a strategy for soft cataract, for a different strategy for the hard cataract. This is what I'm going to show you today. This is an elderly man with a 3+ nuclear sclerosis. This is just to show you the technique of nuclear disassembly. And my main focus will be on the next video, which is a very happening video. A lot of complications happen, and they were very well managed. Patient did well eventually. So here, hydrophilic dissection was not done, so the nucleus cannot be rotated. So my game plan here is to chisel out a wedge-shaped portion of the nucleus from the nasal side. So the nucleus is elevated in the capsular bag, and the lateral separation that happens during the chopping, it is at a more anterior plane. So the forces are not communicated to the posterior capsule and the posterior polar component. And then I'm not rotating the nucleus. I'm just bending. I'm just tilting the phaco-tip to a superior side, facing superiorly, and then I create another chop. So I have created a big chunk which is freed off from the parent nucleus, and that is consumed. So this gives me a lot of space now in the central and inferior, the nasal capsular bag, for me to manage the subincisional lens matter. And for that, you can just lollipop the nucleus with the phaco-tip, bring it in a more accessible area, and consume it with appropriate parameters. Of course, a few manipulations happening in the anterior chamber at a more anterior level, and you need to protect the corneal endothelium with a dispersive OVD. So this patient goes off well. The next patient, actually, he was in his mid 70s. I had done his fellow eye almost a decade earlier. It was uneventful. After the rhexis, I make a hydro-free dissection. Take a cyclodialysis spatula, pass the spatula the way you saw here, and then create a triangle. Like just in the first case I had shown, a triangle that is created from the temporal side, apex on the clear corneal incision, so that I get a tall vertical wall. And then I continue with the same maneuver. I just chop the nucleus. I'm going to get a large chunk of the nucleus on the nasal side, separated from the main body of the nucleus, and subsequently do the same step that I'm going to follow. Now, cortical cleaving hydrodissection is something that should never be done. And I do a hydro-free dissection because it separates the adhesion between the capsule and the underlying lens matter, and thereby it creates a space. So subsequently, when you go for phacoemulsification, the fluid somehow tracks under the capsule, and at the subsequent stage where the nucleus is debulked, there's more space in the capsular bag, the nucleus sort of becomes smooth, easily rotatable. So far, so good. And now at the end of the nucleus removal, I noticed that there is a small opening in the posterior capsule. It was pre-existing. So now I used HPMC here, and later on I realized I should have used Viscoat for this case to plug the hole in the central area, going with bimanual irrigation aspiration. And some of the cortex is taken out. But here again, the mistake number 2 was irrigation was placed very close to where the PC dent was present. That should not have been done. I should have removed the cortex away from the posterior capsular rim, and after that access the area of capsular bag to remove the cortex at a later stage. And I should have used a visco shield strategy to plug the central hole, so that the anterior vitreous face would not have got broken, and I would not have had the vitreous present. So anyway, limbal vitrectomy is performed. 1:2 dilation, triamcinolone acetonide staining. It's very important for us to visualize the vitreous. So after the vitrectomy was done, I thought I'll use the same cutter, the irrigation aspiration cutting mode. This is actually a dual linear control phaco machine. So that was going on, but somehow it was not happening very smoothly. So then I changed my strategy, and then I injected some OVD into the anterior chamber, and went for a dry cortex aspiration. So the dry cortex aspiration does extremely well in this kind of situations where you do not want too much of turbulence in the anterior chamber. There's a large PC dent, and you have already done a vitrectomy. And before I implant the lens, it is again imperative to ensure that there is no vitreous strand in the anterior chamber. And once that is done, the capsular bag is compressed in the periphery. I'm going to keep the lens in the ciliary sulcus. So it's a 3-piece hydrophobic acrylic lens. The leading haptic it just grazes on the anterior capsule, and it goes behind the iris into the sulcus. The trailing haptic is not dial, but I just compress it and keep it under the iris, and it goes into the sulcus. And subsequently, after the lens is properly centered, sulcus is not a very good place for long-term centration. So the lens optic has to be locked into place by obtaining an optic capture. So it is pushed to the rhexis margin posteriorly, as you see here. So now the lens, though it is a 3-piece lens, 13 millimeter length and 6 millimeter optic, it is going to stay very stable in the ciliary sulcus. And this is the post-op picture. This patient has been under follow-up. He has done well. So friends, I would like to conclude by saying that all these patients need preoperative counseling. Even if you feel that there is no little chance of PC dent happening, but they should be counseled. And the surgical strategy has to be customized. You use appropriate FICO parameters and FICO strategy. Use a strategy to minimize damage. No cortical cleaving hydrodissection, hydro-free dissection. I don't do hydrodelineation because when you try to do hydrodelineation, there may be accidental cortical cleaving hydrodissection. Inside out delineation was, I think, developed to prevent this complication. I don't do it, but many surgeons do it and are pretty happy with it. Maintain a deep and stable anterior chamber at all stages. Do a proper anterior vitrectomy and maintain a necessary IOL inventory. Because you may not be always, it may not always be possible for you to keep the lens in the bag. And a single piece hydrophobic acrylic should not go in the sulcus. So you should have a 3-piece design available with you. And in case you don't have it, you can keep the patient FAK and take up the patient for a secondary implantation at a later stage. So this is the strategy that I've been following, and I've been quite happy with managing my post-polar cataract with a PC dent almost 3% to 4%. And I don't think I create a posterior capsular opening if there is no pre-existing posterior capsular opening. And that is the strategy that I follow. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Arup, for nicely explaining those small details. We'll definitely come to we'll come to questionnaire a little later. I would like to go to the second faculty. And is Dr. Anaga Herur there still? I don't see her.
No, sir, she hasn't come. I think she was in another hall. She had messaged.
Okay, in case she hasn't come, then I would like to go to Dr. Tanvi.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so Dr. Tanvi will be doing the next talk, and the talk is on toric practice today and the tipping points. Dr. Tanvi Haldipurkar Venkatramani, she is a cataract and refractive surgery consultant at Lakshmi Eye Institute. She has done a fellowship at Netradama Hospital, Bangalore, and she takes keen interest in learning new surgical techniques and undertook a study to find a novel ECC technique during a residency. And apart from managing refractive surgery department at Lakshmi, she is also an ardent baker, loving mother to her twins and numerous plants. So with this, I hand it over to Dr. Tanvi. Please go ahead.
Thank you. So my timing has started. I'm going to take a little more, 8 minutes. That's what okay. So good evening, everyone. Let's look at our toric practice today and see what's new. A study was done in 2000 odd Indian eyes, and it showed that 40% of those eyes had astigmatism, which was more than 1 diopter. And the astigmatism was with the rule in 28% and against the rule in 51%. And we know that studies have shown that as age increases, the trend is towards against the rule. So in the current scenario of things, we have a lot of eyes that will need a toric correction. The threshold for correcting a monofocal IOL today is 0.75 to 1 diopters, depending on whether the cylinder is with the rule or against the rule. And the cylinder of 0.5 or more is correctable in a multifocal IOL. Now, having said that, let's see how we can improve our toric practice. During my talk, I will be discussing these points. So let's begin. The first and foremost thing to do is to get your data. And once you have it, you need to validate it. So getting data is easy. Even a manual refractometer will give you a value, but doing a quality check is more important. For example, let's look here. This is the reading given by the IOL master for a patient's right and left eye. And then let's look at this reading. They are completely different, although they are of the same patient, just taken 2 hours apart. The magnitude as well as the axis has changed in the right eye. And now why does this happen? We think that the biometry does the job for us, and we assume that the measured data points are correct, but most times this assumption is wrong. In the IOL Master 500 scan on the left, we can see that there is 1 data point missing, and on the right, you can see that the lower scan of the IOL Master 700 shows irregular LED reflection. So these both are variable incorrect scans. Let's look at these lens star readings. Dr. Hill has given us this acceptable range. The keratometry readings as well as the axis of this print are outside this range. And when you go back and look at the data points, you can see that the machine has tagged one as incorrect. When we omit that reading, the standard deviations for the K values do improve, but not the degrees. So this warrants a repeat scan. What I'm trying to say is that even an eye having a dry spot like the one on the left side will give us a reading. And unless we have looked at the raw data, we won't be able to decipher if the scan is accurate or not. So the bottom line is look at your raw data and validate those measurements. And we know that dry eye is a major deterrent.
Tanvi, your volume.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear now? We know that dry eye is a major deterrent in obtaining good scans, and we must be on the lookout for it and even treat it sometimes before. The next step in our toric practice is to get this data and to get it from more than one machine.
Stay close, Tanvi. You're
Sorry?
going back.
Oh,
So the
okay.
audio goes off.
Oh, okay. All right. How about now? Is
Yeah,
this
now it's
fine?
correct. Stay
Yeah.
there.
Okay. All right. So now gone are those days where you could just put in an IOL master or a Lenstar reading, and then with newer advancements, we know that the need for excellent vision has gone up, and we need to do justice. So you need to look at least 2 machines. And if you are truly committed to increasing your toric practice, you will need a topography machine eventually. So what we need to do is we have to use an autorefractometer like the Lenstar or the IOL master as a primary instrument for finding the power difference of the cylinder. And then the topographer becomes your primary instrument. Sorry, it's not going yet. Yeah, then the topographer becomes your primary instrument for finding the steep meridian. So the power is by the IOL master or a Lenstar, and the axis is found by the topographer. So let's look at this side. This Lenstar gives us a reading or a magnitude of cylinder to be at 2.82 diopters at 3 degrees, and the topographer confirms it to be a regular asymmetric against the rule cylinder amounting to 2.7 diopter. And now it is further confirmed with a third instrument like the Varion. Now, if the axis on the biometer, that is our Lenstar here, is within plus or minus 5 degrees from the one that you got on your topography, then you know that the data from the biometry is valid. This is how you confirm your magnitude. And to find the steep axis, an easy way is to just draw a line which bisects the 2 lobes with a ruler on your axial curvature map and see where it lies. That's your steep axis. So now we've got the anterior curvature reading. Let's understand how the posterior corneal astigmatism works. Now, for the same amount of anterior corneal curvature, if the posterior cornea is steeper, the total keratometry of the eye becomes less. We now know that the PC is steeper vertically, and therefore it acts as a plus lens in the horizontal meridian. And therefore this increases the existing against the rule and reduces the with the rule astigmatism. So all those machines which don't measure the posterior curvature will falsely overestimate your with the rule and underestimate your against the rule. So now, where can we get these PC measurements? So there are mainly 2 ways to get those. We have our mathematical models where they use a regression analysis and use a predicted PCA. And then we have our direct measurements. Now, one would think that a direct look at the posterior cornea would be more accurate, but as of today, there is no machine which is able to do that accurately. And the reason for that is that the PC is a very difficult surface to identify and then to quantify. And enough research has told us that the mathematical models work much better than a direct measurement of the PC in a normal cornea. But we also know that in unusual corneas like post-refractive or irregular corneas, it is a good idea to really actually go and look at the direct measurement of the PC. Now, this is a good example to show why PCA should be accounted for. The first is an example of a with the rule astigmatism, which reduced after considering the PC. And this is an example of an against the rule astigmatism, which increased after accounting for the PCA. Now, the first example would not need a toric and the second would. So it's always a good idea to run each eye through the calculator and then avoid the confusion. Let's look at some of the other factors that affect our toric practice. This is an SIA. That we need to look at, that we induce in our patients. In the past, we've had some wrong concepts about it. They have been corrected by Dr. Koch and Dr. Hill. We can see that this plot here is of a femtosecond incision of the same surgeon. It is very variable. The points are very scattered. We know now that we just have to use the centroid value of our SIA. And if you find it too tedious to calculate your own, just go ahead and use a 0.12 diopter for your SIA. But don't go chasing the steep axis. Maintain the same incision at the same location and you'll be fine. So amongst all the calculators, studies have shown that the calculator which studies the ELP and the mathematical models for PCA, they work best. And today a formula like that is the Barrett formula.
Volume.
It is freely available. It can be used for all the IOLs. It calculates the power using an integrated K option. It has a predicted PCA option as well. It also has an option of measured PCA, which you would use for your unusual corneas. And an important point to note here is to not use a total corneal measurement from your machine, because the formula already calculates the PC and you would account for it twice. And always remember to go to the website, which is the APA-CRS or the ASCRS, because your cache in your web browser history sometimes might pop up the older version and you may not get the updates which have been made by Barrett. So once this is how the integrated Ks are taken. We have taken it from the Lenstar, the Varion, and the Topolizer. And then when you hit the calculate button, you will get the IOL power, which is to be implanted, and always go by the axis. We made the mistakes initially to look at the steep axis on the topography and implant it there. Here they have used those integrated Ks and therefore come up with this axis. Even if it is different from your steep axis, trust the machine and go ahead with that. The last point I want to say is that we need to improve our toric alignments. We all have various methods. Initially, it is always better as a beginner to double check, making 2 methods and double checking it with the second. Once we have consistent results, we could stick to one. A new Barrett dual axis marker seems promising. This could be used or compare, kind of combined with the iToric Cam, which is also an app for an Apple user. And this is something new. Dr. Hill has shown a unique way of making a permanent capsular axis landmark. So those who have femto could probably use it. Last point, Oliver Findle and group have found recently that the natural crystalline lens as well as the IOL master tilts anteriorly more on the nasal side, and that seems to act like an against the rule astigmatism. So there are further studies required for it, but I see a day where there will be, we would have to consider tilt beforehand, before the surgery, just like we consider the PCA, and then we would have to adjust the toric IOL that we implant. So to conclude, I would say that we should, as a routine, let all the eyes run through the Barrett toric calculator, because this will definitely improve our clinical results. We may land up putting more torics than we would have thought. We need to check the raw data and then validate it. And we have to use multiple instruments definitely, and use them one as a primary and the others to support it. And then use a formula like the Barrett for an integrated approach. And then finally, if you land in a surprise, use the Barrett RX formula or the astigmatismfix.com, and that will surely help you with your practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tanvi. That was a nice talk. We'll have questions at the end of the, all the talks. Now I go to the next one. The topic is IFRS and small pupil. And to give that talk, we have none other than Dr. Anaga Herur. Anaga Herur is a prolific surgeon and the same smiling lady who conducted the successful Legends in Ophthalmology on Lines with Coffee with. She's a member of ARC team, and over to you, Dr. Anaga.
Thank you so much, sir, for the kind introduction, sir. Sorry for joining in late, and I hope my slide is visible, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me and making me a part of your IC, sir. It's a real honor and privilege for me. So I would be speaking to you all on tipping points in small pupil surgery and IFIS. No financial interest. So basically, the technical challenges of small pupil phaco surgery is because of the reduced visibility, which can end up having damage to the iris, having had a small CCC, having retained lens material, having difficulty in IOL placement. The problem gets compounded if you have a PC rupture, all in all having a poor visual outcome and an unhappy patient. So basically, when you're talking about tipping points, we talk about smaller actions having bigger impact. So let's see, in case of a small pupil, what would be our tipping points. So the first thing is in a pre-operative setting when you examine the patient. So you look at the age of the patient, decide whether if you have a small pupil, is it just a senile rigid pupil? Is it because the patient is uncontrolled diabetic? Or if there is some pseudo exfoliation, and if so, remember that you may have a zonular dehiscence or you may have a zonular weakness, which you may need to explain to the patient, and you need to keep a CTR handy. You may have a patient giving history of medication, which may be because of benign prostatic hyperplasia, and hence you may need to remember that he may have IFIS. Look for posterior synechiae, which could be indications of recurrent iridocyclitis, uveitis. If there's old history of trauma or any glaucoma surgery, or a patient of glaucoma who is on long-term myotics. The second tipping point comes in when you need to finally go ahead with surgery. So you need to fine-tune your surgery, not only with the help of your preoperative screening, but also look at the dilated pupil size and then mentally prepare yourself with a pupillary expander in your kitty when you're actually taking up the patient. Also remember to keep your phaco settings in such a way as to have a reduced vacuum and reduced flow rate, especially when you're going in for an IFIS patient, and keep materials like OVDs and pupil expanders ready. So in this stepwise approach, you come to the first point where you probably need to break adhesions. And always first, whenever there are posterior synechiae, the first thing is you need to have a good synechiolisis. Now, pupillary stretching is something which we may not do today, but this was a video many years ago. And in this patient, I went ahead without using a pupillary expander after doing a pupillary stretching, and I thought that the pupil was well dilated, adequate enough for me to go ahead with the surgery. So when you have a pupil like this, which is just around 5 millimeters, it basically all depends on the skill of the surgeon, the iris tissue properties. So here you have to be careful not to hold on to the pupillary edge with the phaco probe. Even though the size of the CCC may be smaller, you can go ahead and do a good surgery. Now, this was the first day post-op. Patient did well. Now, another tipping point is keeping intracameral agents ready, like Phenokin Plus today, which is the new kid on the block and is usually giving us very good results, and OVDs like Helon 5, where you can also use the tri-shell technique. Now, this was a patient where we had a Phenokin assisted cataract with vitrectomy. This patient had an allergy to tropicamide, and here, as you can see, we are using Phenokin, and within 8 to 10 seconds, you can see that you have a very good, well-dilated pupil and without any problems of allergies post-op. So why I'm specifically showing you this case is not just for the cataract, but we also did a complete vitrectomy in this patient with just Phenokin Plus. So today we are having greater and greater ways and beautiful ways by which we can make our surgeries much better and enhance patients' visual outcomes as well as their comfort without having had to expose them to allergic problems. Now, this was the end of the surgery, a routine surgery because now the pupil is very well dilated, and this was a 3-port vitrectomy for the patient. Now, another tipping point comes when you have to decide about using an expander, pupillary expanding device. Now, the most commonly that we have used is the iris hooks, the Melugan ring, and the BX ring. Now, for example, now this is both two eyes of the same patient having pseudo exfoliation. The one on the left is without iris hooks. When I did this first eye, I thought that the pupil was adequate enough for me to go ahead without a pupillary expander. The only problem in such patients is you have to remain right in the center with the phaco probe. As you can see, the pupil is coming down, and sometimes you can end up having problems. So you need to be really patient. Sometimes you may need to use Epitrate or good viscoelastic at every step so as to give a better pupillary size and dilate it as much as possible mechanically. But if you are careful enough, even when you're doing an irrigation aspiration, be just at the tip. See that you do not hold on either to the pupillary edge or to the rhexis edge so that you don't end up having a zonular dialysis or a pupil which is touched keeps coming down again and again. However, in the other eye, I thought that the pupillary size was very less. So I decided not to have too much of stress, and I decided to use iris hooks. So the only problem with iris hooks is that you need 4 extra side ports. And with each of these side ports, be very careful in putting in these polypropylene hooks. However, one thing you need to be careful is do not actually pull on them too much, because the moment you pull on them too much and go right up to the limbus, you may end up damaging the pupillary sphincter, and then that causes an irregularity in the pupillary pupil shape when you're seeing them post-op. Once you have all these 4 iris retractors in place, you have a very good, adequately opened up pupil for the rest of the procedures. Once the IOL is in place, you very gently remove the protector and then go in and remove the iris hooks very gently. And here you can see how the pupil sphincter has been damaged, and this can cause a lot of glare to the patient. Now, this was a very interesting patient, a one-eyed patient with an anterior chamber depth of just 1.7 millimeters. And here a glaucoma patient where we used a Melugan ring. Now, a Melugan ring is basically extremely handy in such cases, and it has 4 scrolls which you can gently put into even a 2.2 millimeter incision nowadays. And each of this scroll is then kept along the pupillary margin very, very gently. First the leading one, and then the trailing, and then the nasal and the temporal. And once that is put, all the other steps of the cataract surgery, including the IOL implantation, become very easy. When you're removing it, you just hook on to the one of the scrolls and then pull it out. However, you first gently need to release them from the pupillary margin. Now you have the BX pupillary expander here today. And this was a patient where, very interestingly, we thought that the pupil was good enough. We went ahead with the CCC, but you can see here now in what happens. Once the CCC was done, I thought we would just go ahead with the hydrodissection and for the treatment. Now you can see how, unfortunately, the pupil just came down for no reason. In spite of using Epitrate and Phenocaine plus, the pupil absolutely didn't open up at all. So in this case, we went ahead and used a BHEX. Now the BHEX can be used with a 23 gauge forceps. It's a very, very gentle, flexible ring, which can be used easily even through the side port, and it can be kept used also along with the Sinskey hooks. Once the 3 flanges are underneath the iris, it can make life much easier, and very easily it can be removed also once the IOL has been put inside the eye. All you need to do is just hold on to the BHEX ring and then remove it. In the IFIS, it's basically iris that billows in response to even normal irrigating currents, propensity for prolapse and progressive constriction, basically due to tamsulosin and alpha-1 receptor antagonist. It basically has atrophy of the dilator muscles, as you can see here. Basically, you can use topical atropine sulfate pre-op, viscoadaptives like Helon 5. What does not work, however, is stopping Flomax, pupillary stretching, and sphincterotomies. Do not overfill the OVDs. This was a patient with floppy iris where we used a multifocal IOL and the patient did well. This was the post-op day 1. I think we are already beyond time. This was another patient with very, very small pupils, and there was a total membrane in the pupillary area. And finally, we used a BHEX ring, and at the end of the surgery, the patient did really well. This was the post-op. Patient vision was 6/9. So these are various pupillary expanding devices that you can use. And to conclude, all the use of these expanders can help you give good visual outcomes even in problems with small pupils and IFIS. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Managa. That was a nice, very comprehensive one. Let's go to the next topic, and that's also equally important. That's presbyopia practice, the tipping points. And to give that talk, we have none other than Dr. Vijay Shetty, a senior consultant, a cataract and glaucoma specialist at Lakshmi. He's an experienced surgeon and an avid teacher who has loads of young ophthalmologists who vouch by his teaching and training. In fact, his skills in phaco training are universally acknowledged. And I have pleasure, Dr. Vijay, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank Haldipurkar sir for giving me an opportunity to be a part of this IC. So my topic for the day is presbyopic lenses. So as you know, the correction of presbyopia following cataract surgery with conventional IOLs requires the patient to use bifocal lenses or progressive lenses. Bifocal lenses comes with its own set of problems like image jump, lesser working distance, uncomfortable head position during work. Although progressive lenses gives a good intermediate distance, it has its problem with respect to restricted field of vision limited by head and eye movements for the horizontal plane, and also the distortion when viewed sidewards. So there was always a need for presbyopia correction during cataract surgery. The options for presbyopic correction during cataract surgery include monovision, multifocal lenses, and EDOF lenses, which could be diffractive technology or wavefront technology. And the newer lenses are trifocal, quadrifocal, and EDOF multifocal combinations. So technology used in presbyopic correcting IOLs are refractive technology, which was used in older multifocals, diffractive technology, which is used in most of the modern lenses, including trifocal, multifocal, and EDOF lenses, wavefront technology, which uses the principle of altering the spherical aberration currently used in some EDOF lenses like Minivel and Eye-Enhanced lenses. So when light passes through a stenopic slit or a diffractive gratings, the light deviates by an amount which is actually related to the step width of the diffraction grating. Narrower the step, higher the power. And the step height decides the light distribution between distance and near. So by reducing the step width, we can increase the add power of a multifocal lens. And by increasing the height of the diffraction grating, more light can be dedicated to near compared to distance. So when light passes through a diffraction grating, most of the light goes undeviated, which is called zero order diffraction. This light is used for distance vision. And majority of the other part light gets deviated by an angle theta, which is called first order diffraction. This is used for near vision. And in addition to this first order diffraction, there are various other orders of diffraction which gets deviated more than angle theta, which are actually not used for vision and hence considered as lost energy in diffractive lenses. Among the various diffraction grating designs, H-slit grating is of particular interest because it has an optimal blaze angle, which is the angle between the lens surface and the diffraction grating surface, which when optimized gives more energy distribution to the higher order diffraction. So this technology is particularly used in Symphony lenses, which is a lens by Johnson & Johnson. Working distance for routine tasks needs a working distance of 40 to 80 centimeters. Hence, the current multifocal lenses with bifocal technology may not suffice the need. So then there came the trifocal technology. Trifocal lenses are made by combining two diffractive structures of two different ads, resulting in 3 foci. Then came the quadrifocal technology. In contrast to trifocal technology, which has focus for distance 80 centimeter and 40 centimeter, quadrifocal technology has focus for distance 120, 60 and 40 centimeters. However, 120 centimeter focus is deviated to the distance to give a better distance vision. And now the intermediate focus is at 6 centimeters instead of 80 centimeters, which is more comfortable for routine work. Then comes the wavefront technology. Here, there is a positive spherical aberration which is induced in the center, surrounded by a negative spherical aberration in the mid-periphery, followed by a peripheral aspheric zone. This gives a good intermediate vision and hence used in EDOF lenses like mini well lenses. The other wavefront technology is a smooth transition of power from periphery to the center, which is used in Techni's Eyhance lenses. The intermediate vision given by this lens is moderate and is at a much higher distance than mini well lenses. EDOF multifocal combination technology is a breakthrough technology. Here, multifocal and diffractive multifocal and diffractive EDOF lens technology is combined. That is, a Technis multifocal and Technis Symphony is combined to get a synergy lens. Here, there is a focus for distance, intermediate, and near. And in addition to this, the Johnson & Johnson has a technology of achromatic lenses, which reduces the chromatic aberration and hence gives a better quality of vision. So how do we choose the right presbyopic lenses? It again depends on the patient requirement and patient expectation, also on the affordability and eye characteristics. So the first thing is to identify the patient's requirement and expectation. So first, we should know what are the routine activities, both outdoor and indoor, working distance for reading, and does he have to drive after the evening, the current refractive status, whether he's myope, hyperope, or emetrope, does he consider need of glasses as a failure, or are some halos acceptable to the patient after surgery? So once we assess the patient requirement, we know that multifocal lens gives distance and near vision, EDOF lenses gives distance and intermediate vision, and trifocal lenses gives vision for all the 3 distances. However, we need to address the patient's expectation before we counsel the patient for presbyopic lenses. If the patient's need for reading, if the patient thinks that need for reading glasses is considered as failure of presbyopic lens, or if he's habitually reads at a closer distance as in myopes, or need to read at lower illumination is required, then consider multifocal IOLs with higher ad. If the patient is needs to frequently drive after it becomes dark and some degree of halos around a point source of light is considered as completely unacceptable, then either put monofocals or non-diffractive EDOF lenses. Depending on the scotopic pupil size, if it is a small pupil with a distance priority, then consider monofocals and no multifocals would be suited for these patients. If the pupil is large and he needs a distance priority, then consider trifocal or epidermis multifocals. If he has a near priority, again consider multifocal IOLs with higher ads. Visual angle is important in planning presbyopic lenses. Angle alpha is the angle between visual axis and the optical axis. Angle kappa is the angle between pupillary axis and the visual axis. If the patient has a large angle kappa, then consider a lens which has got a highest central zone diameter, as in PanOptix and Symphony. If the patient has got a large angle alpha, then better to avoid it's better to avoid multifocals and consider monofocals. In addition, if the patient has dry eye, irregular cornea, zonular weakness or mild subluxation, glaucomatous disease or macular disease, then it is better to avoid presbyopic lenses. Preoperative evaluation includes dry eye evaluation, macular evaluation including OCT, potential acuity meter, topography. This helps in ruling out unsuitable cases for presbyopic lenses. In addition, good optical biometry and image-guided system, especially in case of multifocal toric lenses, would help in improve the results. Two things can destroy any relation: unrealistic expectation and poor communication. So exchange of information is important. The education regarding halos, glare, and starburst before the patient goes for a surgery is important. Finally, we need to balance between spectacle dependence and certain photic phenomena. Although the photic phenomena are much lesser with newer lenses, it is still there in most of the diffractive lenses. So good communication, good patient selection, and good IOL selection helps in getting a better, happy patient and a happy doctor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vijay. So very nicely dealt with a relatively difficult topic. And now we come to another important topic, and that's my contribution to present-day cataract. And to deliver that talk, we have none other than Dr. Amar Agarwal, an iconic name in ophthalmology. His contribution to ophthalmology is keeping all of us busy in our daily practice, where all the time we keep using one or other of his innovations. But only complaint we have is every time we watch him and try and copy his technique, he changes the goalpost, and further it has moved, and it becomes difficult for us to even come closer. So with this, I present to you my loving friend, Dr. Amar, for his delivery of his talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suhas. It's first of all a pleasure to see Tanvi on screen here. And to be honest to you, very, very happy to see Anagha also here with us. So let's now see some cases. And I thought the first case, which I thought I'll show you here, is a patient of RK and AK. Now you see the patient has had RK and AK. The vision is 660. The problem in these patients with RK is this: you put any lens, toric IOL or non-toric or whatever it is, these powers change. That is one of the biggest problems which you face. One is to calculate the power is wrong, tricky. But second bigger problem is it changes. So you need some time for it to stabilize. The phaco portion, when you do, be careful, because sometimes if the incision is not correct, those radial cuts can extend. And you see, as I'm doing my phacoemulsification, the phaco portion is easy. The problem is in that incision, it can extend and the RK cuts can open, which will again create more astigmatism. Now, this patient had about more than 10 diopters of astigmatism. So far, so good. We have done the surgery on. Look at my small cut made in the conjunctiva, which has created that small problem of the ballooning of the conjunctiva. But still, we are able to put the lens inside, lens of your choice. Now, the reason I'm showing this is such cases, and my article of this is coming out in the JCRS soon. It's already, perhaps in the next issue, it might come out. Fix a trocar AC maintainer. See, the trocar AC maintainer goes above the iris, just 0.5 millimeter from the sclera. I'll explain to you why I'm doing that. Now, the game plan is simple. I am going to do a pinhole pupil. So the simple procedure is make it like a pinhole pupil of approximately 1.5 millimeters. Nowadays, with Jack Holiday, we have done work now, and we have brought out a Holiday device made by Epsilon, in which you can do preoperatively assess which pupil is best for the particular patient. Now, when you're talking of the single pass fourth-row pupillasty, just remember, you need the paracentesis only on one side. It's a very simple procedure. You take a Prolene needle, pass it straight through the cornea from the other one side. Other side, you've got a 30 gauge needle, railroad the two, bring the loop out, remember the number 4. Now I can keep on doing this till my pupil becomes small. Look, the pupil is still large. If you see the Purkinje image, and that's a simple pinhole marker which you have. Nowadays, I'm using even the eyepiece of the microscope, which has got a reticule to get accuracy on the pinhole size. Now, if the pupil has become too small, and that's why I have fluid in the eye, I use a vitrectomy probe to enlarge it a little bit. And you can see there. But the key is the Purkinje image P1 should be bang centered. Question comes, how did this patient behave with 10 diopters of astigmatism? And I told you, they will also have this problem of unstable refraction, which we have to handle. So let's see exactly how this patient behaved at the end of the day. And you'll see this just now. Here, I'm just fixing this thing with glue here, the conjunctiva back in place there, fixing that eye properly so that there's no leak. And see the final picture, pre-op 660, post-op improved to 612. Now let's take another situation which we have here. And I thought I'll show this to you here. Now, when you have a problem of iridodialysis, which I wanted to show you, and we submitted this in the global contest, and it was among the top 5 videos selected. You see this patient has an iridodialysis, but look at the Purkinje image. It is not centered. So when you are going to fix this patient's vision, how will you fix him? This patient will be only about 660 vision. So what I'm suggesting to you is fix a trocar AC maintainer. Now you see I'm fixing a trocar opposite the iridodialysis. You can go through the sclera or you can go through the cornea. Once you have done that, now you take a double-armed Prolene needle. Look at this. This is the trocar. Now I'm passing this through the iridodialysis. On the other side, a 30 gauge needle. The advantage is when you go from 6 to 12 especially, it can get stuck when you pass the needle into the corneal tissue. Second advantage of the trocar here is I can guide it exactly where I want it. And because the trocar will guide it very, very comfortably. Here you see I pass the 30 gauge needle now from the scleral side, railroaded these two. Once they are railroaded, I bring that loop out. It's a very simple procedure which anyone can do. We have the swing machine technique. We have the modified swing machine technique. We have other techniques also. But the hangback technique of Michael Snyder, I like, and we modified it with the trocar-assisted iridodialysis repair technique. Now you see the next step, which I wanted to show you, is the second arm of the Prolene coming inside this area. You can also go this way. That is, pass the 30 gauge into the iris. Then it becomes even sometimes easier to railroad on this side. Either way, the principle still remains the same. Both arms of the Prolene come out. Once they come out, all you need to do is suture it, just tie it out there. You notice I made a scleral groove on the scleral side. But the reason I'm showing you this video is for another reason. Look what's happening when the iridodialysis repair is being done. It's pulled to one side. When it's pulled to one side, look at my pupil, it gets distorted. And that's when the next portion comes in, which is the two-fold technique. In other words, one is the iridodialysis repair, as you're seeing the animation, which you now have understood very well about. But the second is now do the single pass fourth-row pupillasty. Because when you do this single pass fourth-row pupillasty, then you will make the pupil bang on track where you want it. So see now, I've done the trocar-assisted iridodialysis. Now I'm going to do the single pass fourth-row pupiloplasty. So now you'll see these patients improving drastically. Remember one thing, when you do cataract surgery, refractive iris repair is going to be a huge part of life from now onwards, because we have understood now that that Purkinje image should be bang centered. The pupil should not be so badly distorted like having an iridodialysis, which is coming across the pupillary margin. These patients need surgery done. Now, in such cases, you don't need to make a pinhole pupil. If you want, you need not do it in this case because the patient might not have an astigmatism like in the previous case. But either way, the Purkinje image has to be bank centered. So I'm using the vitrectomy probe. That's one of the reasons why I have fluid in the eye. So when I use my vitrectomy probe, it's very, very easy for me to manipulate and fix. And now you can see the end result of the patient, absolutely okay. So I'd like to thank Suhas for inviting me for this lovely course of his. I just want to tell you one thing on Suhas. I don't think you can find a better surgeon, teacher, but most important, a gentleman and a man with a heart. That sort of quality to get in a human being, and I'm sure everybody, including Tanvi, will agree with me, it is nearly impossible. And that's some person I really respect all over the globe. It's Suhas. When I was in America once, somebody was telling me about how Suhas conducts his lovely courses to teach phacoemulsification in some cold area. I've forgotten the location also, where it's freezing. And people from all over the world come and learn from Suhas. Suhas, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amar. I'm really touched. And we'll come back for some more questions at the end. I'll take you to the next topic, and that's femto victories and different cataract surgeries. And to give that, we have none other than Dr. Partho, our celebrated Chairman Scientific Committee of this year. And, he has special compliments, sir, because you have taken virtual conference to a new level. He's a dynamic surgeon who has put in great efforts to take, ophthalmology in East India to a new level. And we all look forward to you as a leader of this, academic field. Dr. Partho, please go ahead with your talk.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Okay. Sir, is that okay, sir? Suhas, sir, is this fine?
Perfect. Please go ahead.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. So every time I'm here with Suhas, sir, whenever I am in a course or otherwise also, I have to say this and that loud and clear. Suhas, many, many years ago. And I am totally indebted to him for all the advancements could have made during this time. Thank you very much. So we will femto victories in difficult cataract. It is not possible to show all the femto victories, but I will take you through one or two important situations and then a very special situation which I want to let you know. And this is a pupil that is, of course, mid-dilated pupil that you can see. And the opening is sometimes a little difficult, and especially the side port opening. And I specifically wanted to show you this, that if in the proper technique, you see the spatula going in quite well, however, it is not always very rosy. The other thing that I wish to show in this is the importance of staining the anterior capsule, though the capsular excess has already been made, but still you need to stain it. And then for the harder cataracts, again, I selected this particular video to show you that hard cataracts do require special settings. If your settings are not too good, then you will not be able to do clean so that the cleavage is not all that regular. It should have been better, more energy should have been used, and thereby this hard cataract, though it's becoming easier than what would have been in a direct chop, in such cases, it is easier definitely with the femto, but here I would like to say that it is to be made with proper settings. And as you can see, it's quite a hard cataract, and there is hydration of the ports already occurring before gone into the full nucleus disassembly. And you can see quite hard how hard elastics as you go ahead. So these steps are important, though it's just not important to have a good femto laser platform, but it's also important to have the applications people help you to redefine as well as fine-tune the settings on the platform. So I began with this specific video just to show you that if it is not in optimal setting, then all is not well, even if you have a good femto laser platform. So this is the nucleus disassembly, and we will go on to the next small video. And this is again a video of a subluxated cataract. Now, this is again a very special situation in which a subluxated cataract anteriorly, and the anterior space is so small. It is quite shallow, the anterior chamber, and we have to improve upon the settings. So we have improved upon the settings, and this time we are a little careful. And you could see that when I took the side port incision in, it touched the anterior part of the capsule. So you understand that it is so shallow. So we have to be very, very careful in this situation, and I on purpose did not do the side port as well as the main port, and we did a very gentle hydrodissection. But what is important in this case is look at the way that we could do a hydrodissection in this one. And the most toughest part of any subluxated cataract is what? It is the capsular axis, because as the subluxation, the zonule laxity is an issue, and you do not have the force and the counter force acting upon. Therefore, the most important part or the most difficult part of a subluxated cataract is the capsular axis at times. So this capsular axis otherwise has been well made because of the provision of the femtosecond laser, and then the removal of the nuclei are not so difficult. And you can see in this case, there's been a nice cleavage and everything is quite good. This is just about a grade 2 cataract, nothing much. This could have been done otherwise had it not been for the subluxation by just phacoemulsification. But what importance or improvement in the technique the femto laser gives is the capsular axis, and then with a good and stable chamber, I'm able to put in the CTR quite well. So once the CTR is in place, the next things become quite easy, and it's a stable bag. We are working in stable environment, and then all these pieces can come around, and the next part is not so difficult. So I will not dwell upon the next part, and I will go to maybe the next video. Now, this is a very, very particular video, and I have placed this on purpose, just to give a little bit of a twist to this session. So this was a nightmare in phaco surgery, and we made it into a film, and it is one of the worst nightmares of my life in any surgery, not femto, but any surgery. I think this is the only time I had such a complication, and it is truth and it is real. So I had it in Amar's OPL also at one point of time. And so this is the video that I'm going to share with you now. This has important aspect, and we do not have any financial interest at all to disclose. So this was a patient which just came up with 636 vision and clear cornea and grade 3 cataract. And we went on to do the femtolaser and technique. And this is the plan that we did, and the femtolaser was done. So all this went on very well. So no issues here. And we opened up the incision and took out the rhexis. So you can see it's just about a grade 2, grade 3 cataract, nothing major. But the patient was a very apprehensive patient, very, very apprehensive. It took him nearly months to decide upon the cataract. He made sure that I was a surgeon who could handle his cataract. He made sure that we had good equipment. He made sure that we had the right femtolaser machine and also the phaco machine. Obviously, he made sure that we were using the right lens. And for all such patients, what happens? For all such patients, complications happen. Yes, I'll just take one more minute. So we had, in this case, a rhexis run out. The rhexis run out. God only knows how I had it. But it was there. So thankfully, it was not a very large one, and it did not extend too long. And this of is what you need to see. And so we put in the lens. You can see there's a little bit of cortical matter, which I'll take out after I've placed the lens in. And the lens I've placed in perpendicular to the haptics, and all was going well. But then as I close this, and you're going to see something that possibly you've never seen before, or I hope you never see before. And at this point of time, patient was very, very sick. And look at this. This is vomitus in the eye. The patient coughed and vomited and turned, and the whole vomitus came into the eye. It is truth. And then we had, this is, of course, the role play that we did for this patient. But I'll go on to the next part, and we advised him the regular, and I was absolutely scared. But remember, we had actually closed the incisions with tightness, and this was what he presented next day. And whole night, none of our whole team members could sleep, but this is what we came up with the literature. Femtosecond laser versus the manual clear corneal incision cataract surgery, and did show that the tightness of the wound is very important. We had cleaned the whole area. We put in every 15 minutes, this patient got antibiotics both for the gram-positive and the gram-negatives, and we asked ourselves, did flax save the day? Because surgery was not complete, the ports fully not hydrated, and the vomitus was there in the cul-de-sac. So yet no infection, and God willing, that of course. So thank you very much. Femto is a reality, and it's really ready for prime time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Partho. And now, the last speaker is me. And my talk is on loose bag and safe surgery. All the talks have been excellent and very much in time. So at the end of my talk, we can definitely have some questions. So what's a loose bag? A developmental absence of zonules, degenerative disorders giving you, cases like pseudo-exfoliation, traumatic zonular tears. And when it comes to safe surgery, it simply is careful removal of cataractous lens, long-term stability of capsular bag, and in the event of loss of bag, safe and secure fixation of lens with acceptable visual rehab. When it comes to management strategy, I would like to delay the surgery as long as I can if the vision is correctable with glasses or contact lenses. If you have to intervene, try and preserve the bag as much as possible so that lens implantation is possible. And of course, obviously, in the absence of capsular bag, explore the best options. Pre-operative evaluation is very important. The location of defect, degree of zonules, vitreous in the AC, and presence or absence of phacodonosis is important. Obviously, we need capsular supporting devices. There are temporary ones and long-term ones. So iris hook used as pupillary expansion device in small pupil are also used as capsule supporting devices when the zonules are weak. When it comes to timing and number of hooks, if the rhexis can be completed without much of stress on the zonules, hooks will come in soon after the rhexis. In extreme loose bag, capsular hooks come in soon after the first nick of the capsule, nick in the capsule. Sometimes 4 to 7 hooks may be needed to adequately support the bag until the nucleus is managed. Now let's look at this. This is an extremely loose bag. Less than 25% of the zonules are supporting the bag. The eye is filled with good quality dispersive viscoelastic or viscoelastics like Elon 5. And I very, very carefully continue with the rhexis. At any stage, if I feel that no more, then I would stop, put a couple of hooks and continue with the rhexis. But fortunately, it is possible here. But what comes is after that. Now here, in a loose bag, to get a space to go between the rhexis and the nucleus mass is extremely difficult because the bag is loose, it's all the time moving. So sometimes you have to use a 26 number needle to so if you look at this, this is an extremely, extremely tricky situation in most of these extremely loose bags. It is just that you have to spend time to get some space and get your first hook in. Once the hook is in, then you have relatively good support on the bag, and the subsequent hooks is not really an issue. And in this case, I decided to have 5 hooks to be on a safe ground. So choice between rings and segments, when the zonular loss is less than 90 degrees, capsular tension ring alone will work. When the zonular loss is less than 180 degrees, Sione's capsular tension ring works well. But when the loss is more than 180 degrees, like in this case, in the presence of weak zonules, CTR in combination with a segment is a safe alternative. Now, in this case, there are extremely weak zonules. I have already planned to go for a segment. I make a Hoffman's pocket. Again, in this case, with a good dispersive viscoelastic, it is possible to make your rhexis. And then the trick is to make a very copious hydrodissection so that your bag is literally separated from your nucleus mass. Then use capsular hooks to fix it. And removal of cataract is not an issue here. Once the bag is completely opened up, then you go in for endocapsular ring, which gives you 360-degree support on the bag, and the bag is little more made taut. And after that, you come with a nano needle from outside and get it in, and with a railroad technique, with a 26 number needle, you take it out. And in this case, I'm using Ahmed segment. And the needle is passed back. And the sutures are removed outside, and the Ahmed segment is placed with convexity outside, and you loosely tie it. And once the lens is in and the viscoelastic is washed out, the suture in the Hoffman's pocket is tied, and the lens is well centered and the pupil is constricted. Now, this was a case done several years back, maybe 13 years back, when a boy came with a trauma with blood in the AC, blood and the bitters in the AC. So this patient at that time underwent surgery. I decided to put endocapsular ring, decided to put Sione's ring at that time. That time, we didn't have the concept of, pupilloplasty for traumatic mydriasis. And then subsequently, when we knew about pupilloplasty, I did try and convince him but somehow he wasn't very convinced because he had no issue with glare. And then, so when the lens was put, he still continued to have a large dilated pupil. And then he comes 13 years later with the lens decentered. And what has happened is the suture that was a Tenno suture at that time, it broke and the lens came on this side. So this time I decided to, now it's a loose bag, go with the 9/0 needle and thread it through that central eyelet and try and pull it. And this time I didn't want to miss the chance and do a proper pupilloplasty and get a pupil center. And with this, although he had, trauma and his vision had never improved, this time and over the years, his vision continued to improve. Now, this patient came recently. He was operated 5 years before, and he had a trauma which led to the bag lens complex, coming into the AC. And I decided to, again open up the bag and try and fix a segment. This time I'm using an ICR segment, but it was easy for me to get my needle in, but I had to literally separate it because the segment had to sit in it. Under a scleral flap, I use the same technique where the needle is brought out, and then this is an ASIA anchor. It's a beautiful piece. It's like a paper clip. So unlike in an AMAT segment, your pupil can nicely, slide over it without any obstruction. So here, that clip is tied, and the entire, that anteriorly dislocated bag is pushed back, and the pupil is brought in, and at the end of it, he recovers his vision well. And the last picture at the end of the surgery, when I use glue to close that conjunctiva, is something like this. But then, subsequently, that pupil retained its. So these were some of the pieces I thought I would share with you. So let's go to some of the questions. So first of all, I think let's start with the first talk. Dr. Arup.
Yes, sir.
I just wanted to know what would be your, when you're doing your dry cortex aspiration, you said you use, sometimes you prefer to inject visco and do it. So what's that visco that you prefer between, cohesive and dispersive and now methyl Which of those would you prefer to use and be comfortable, because most of it can go into the vitreous?
Sir, I would definitely prefer to use Viscoat, which contains the chondroitin sulfate. This was much better than HPMC. Yeah. And in terms of postoperative ocular hypertension, pressure elevation, Viscoat performs better than HPMC. Okay.
So that would be your Viscoat choice. And what's your opinion with regards to today when we need to do vitrectomy? We prefer to go in for some of us go for a pars plana as well. Like when you're doing your PPC, and if you have a PC rupture and you're due, would you still be comfortable going with limbal, or pars plana would be one of your choices?
Sir, I prefer to go through the pars plana for secondary procedures. Okay. And on the primary procedure, usually I do a bimanual vitrectomy, because most of the time when I get a PCRN today, it's a very uncooperative patient. I have to finish off the surgery very fast. So it saves me a lot of time if I just do the vitrectomy through the limbus, bimanual vitrectomy through the limbus. On the other hand, if I get a patient where anterior vitrectomy has to be done as a secondary procedure, I prefer to go through the pars plana. For example, if there is a vitreous knuckle that is presented postoperatively, when through an unrecognized or recognized zonular dialysis or a PCRN, in that case, instead of approaching from the anterior approach, I'll go from the pars plana and do the vitrectomy. So it works much better.
Okay. Is Dr. Amar there? Okay. So, Anaga, I would like you to tell me, do you have any set rules for which case would you go for which type of a ring? Because you see, we have, variety of rings, or your preference for a particular ring for a particular type of a pupil.
A lovely question, sir. So, as I said earlier in my talk, I usually choose between the iris hooks, the BHEX, and the Malugan. So, iris hooks was what I used to use earlier, but today my first choice would be a BHEX ring because it's very, very gentle on the pupil. If the anterior chamber depth is very less, or if it's a rigid pupil, then I would go ahead with a Malugan ring. Only if it's a very, very small pupil and there's a, like a total posterior synechiae and a very irregular pupil, then maybe I would go ahead with an iris hook if I feel that the BHEX would not be able to really expand the pupil to that size, and if the patient is not affording a Malugan.
Okay.
I just have a comment here. Now, if the anterior chamber is shallow, like in one of the cases, Dr. Anaga had shown 1.8 millimeters. And if it is a shallow anterior chamber, I think my preference would be to use iris hooks and not any ring device which requires intraocular manipulations. It's highly subjective. It depends upon the surgeon, but my preferred pattern. And if it's an IFIS case, very small people, fellow had a bad IFIS, I would use iris hooks.
Oh, really? For an IFIS? Oh, yeah, that's a good point. So that means if you have a bad IFIS, your preference would be a hook over a ring.
Exactly, sir.
Okay, maybe a diamond fashion would be better.
Diamond fashion or pentagon, five points.
Okay, yeah, good. So that means, Arup, for a beginner dealing with small pupil, what will be your takeaway option in terms of expanding? I think obviously the hooks would be your.
That are much easier, easily accessible.
Yeah. Okay, Tanvi, are you there? Yeah. Tanvi, in your toric workup, you were talking about several machines. So I was just wondering, what would be your thought on considering epithelial profile measurement in your toric workup?
So that is the area of interest nowadays, because we are seeing a lot of dry eye patients. So as a routine, we have been doing those patients. We are running them through the ASO CT scan. And we have seen that if they have dry eye, if it's moderate to severe, there is a lot of epithelial thickening. And we need to remember that the corneal astigmatism comes from the anterior and the posterior cornea. And the anterior cornea, the epithelium plays a major role. We have also seen some cases where the cylinder was quite high and it corroborated with an epithelial thickening, and then post-treatment that cylinder has gone down. So we might have overcorrected them initially if we would have gone ahead and done at that point. So it does have a very good supplementary role in the sense to understand how the astigmatism is working. So we are doing it for most patients.
Okay, thank you.
Tanvi, I just wanted to ask you one thing. You had your presentation is really nice, but I did not see the slit lamp marking on your armamentarium. When I 100% of my cases are marked with the slit lamp.
Yes, sir. So there wasn't a picture there, but yes, of course, that is one of our, I mean, I would do that as a 2 procedure things. One, I would mark it manually and then re-see that on the slit lamp. Okay. As a beginner, one should ideally do that.
Okay, so, for want of time, I'll always come back if there is some more time. I would go to Dr. Vijay. Vijay, that's a very important talk that you touched on for presbyope practice, because presbyope is really taking on much more in today's time. So if monetary consideration is not there, what will be your lens of choice in presbyope practice?
Most of the patients now are active even after the age of 60, and they keep working both on mobile and laptop. So they need both intermediate and near vision. So I would choose the trifocal lens or the synergy lens, which acts very much similar to trifocal lenses. That would be my first choice if the patient is not much into night driving, and then he needs to be active and wants to be less dependent on glasses.
Okay. Anaga, how stringent will you be in your presbyope practice with regards to aberration findings or angle studies when it comes to implanting a particular presbyopic lens?
If pre-existing corneal higher order aberrations exist, like for example in a post-refractive surgery patient or like a post-LASIK, then definitely I would avoid putting in a multifocal IOL. However, like you said in the second case, in case of angle alpha, I would probably go ahead more up to 0.7 instead of just 0.5, because probably it could be just a hype. However, most importantly, if it's a high hyperope, then definitely it makes a little more importance. However, if it's a myopic patient and the IOL diopter is very less, and if the central diameter or the zone is higher, like 1.75, even a Trinova, I saw Dr. Vijay Shetty's presentation, excellent. Even a Trinova has a larger central zone, so it's a little more forgiving, maybe you can go ahead. But with a higher dioptric lens, then it's best to avoid putting in a multifocal in such patients.
Thank you. Thank you. Partho, what will be the way forward for wider usage of femto technique among one and all in the times to come?
शेयर में बैठ फाइनल करके एकदम सर मैं
Partho, are you heard the question? So the question is, what will be the way forward for a wider usage of femto, since you think femto is a great technique and which I believe among most of us in future?
Yeah, sir, could you repeat the question just once more, please?
All right. Now that will require a little timing. I'll come to another one. Which are the cases where femto has had the biggest impact during cataract surgery?
Okay, sir. So the first is the hard cataract, the subluxated cataract, the posterior polar cataract. These three cases have definitely had a great advantage with the femto laser.
Okay. So do you think the femto would be the technique of tomorrow with more and more people accepting it?
Sir,
maybe remaining with a very small segment?
Yes, sir. So our hurdle of doing femto in all patients is the financial cost. If, for instance, if we think that the financial cost was affordable to everybody who has a phaco machine, I think femto will become the standard of care. At one point of time during the learning phase, it used to take a lot of time to do a femto laser cataract, but now it doesn't take so long. And even if there's a very busy surgery list, that also can be done. One surgeon can do the femto part, the phaco part can be done by the other surgeon in the OR. So these things can be improvised and these things can come. The stumbling block is the huge cost involved.
Okay, I think, but maybe when things start becoming a little more economical,
yes,
probably.
A lot more, sir, not little more, but a lot more economical. Only then.
Dr. Haldipurkar, I have a question. I've been watching everything and really wonderful. Sir, where do you get your MH segment from?
Well, MH segments, I think many of them do.
So which one do you prefer?
Well, I get them from, some 3-4 centers. I get them from Freedom, I get them from IOCare, I get them from Aurolab. But then now, MH segment is not my thing of choice. I all the time use these ASIA anchors. There's a company of in Bangalore which deals, even though they are more superior. Yeah, thank you so much. Cyrus, you were there for the course, and I think Arup, the time is probably up, or do we have still time for some more discussion?
So we have more 2 minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay, I'll use those 2 more minutes to thank all my faculty. It's been a nice course. Thank you one and all, and a lot of good points really came out of this discussion. Thank you so much.
I would like to make a special mention, and I would like to thank you because you introduced all of us so beautifully, but I thought somebody should have introduced you, and I would like to thank you for that. You are a brilliant surgeon, a great academician. You have helped all of us learn phacoemulsification. You're absolutely a pioneer, and we have been looking at all your videos and learning so much from them. Thank you so much, sir, for so much of learning. It's our honor and privilege to be a part of your course. And thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
And keep teaching us, sir. Keep teaching us all the time.
Yes.
That's cool. Thank you so much.
Sir, I'll also like to grab this opportunity by thanking everyone. Fantastic and insightful presentation by all our speakers and amazingly moderated by Dr. Suhas, sir. let's have a huge round of applause for our speakers and moderator. Thank you, everyone. By this, we come to the end of the session.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, and have a great
Thank
evening
you.
ahead.